All right, well, we might make a start. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. But before we do begin, I would just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the various lands that we're all coming together from today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us. On behalf of the National Centre of Implementation Science, it's my pleasure to have you with us for our webinar on implementation outcomes and measures. I'm Meg Finch and I'm joining on the lands of the Awabakal people in the beautiful Lake Macquarie region of New South Wales. I'm also thrilled to welcome Serene Yoong, who is the Deputy Director of the National Centre of Implementation Science. And I'll hand over to Serene in a second just to kick us off. But before we do, I'm also really excited to introduce you to Cat Lane, also from the National Centre of Implementation Science in the University of Newcastle, and also Tara Boelson-Robinson from the Refresh Centre for Research Excellence and Deakin University. So Serene, Cat and Tara will be presenting today. I'll hand over to those guys for, a wonderful series of presentations. So just to let you know too that we will be holding the questions for the end of the session, and if you could pop any questions into the chat, we'll be taking questions from the chat, so put them in there as we go along, and we'll get to those at the end. We'll also be posting a very brief evaluation survey in the chat at the end, so if you have the time to do that, we'd really value your feedback about the session. So that's all from me. So I think, I'll hand over to Serene to make a start.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'll share my screen. I assume it's come up. So as Megan said, I'm Serene. I'm an associate professor in dietetics with Swinburne University of Technology. I am also deputy director of the centre, and I currently hold an ARC DEFRA fellowship that looks at exploring mechanisms in kind of scaling up and implementing nutrition guidelines into community settings. So a lot of my work has been with these settings, primarily childcare in schools, and the measurement of implementation outcomes has been kind of very pertinent in trying to work out the key mechanism questions. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. So I'm on Wurundjeri land today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I thought I would give some brief objectives of the webinar. Really, I feel like I'm the warm-up act to the next two wonderful presentations coming up. I will attempt to provide a broad overview on what implementation outcomes are. I'll also briefly touch on some of the early resources that you can use to help with exploring some measurement tools that are already available, and you may find this useful just as a starting point in terms of how to start and what to do. And then I will be followed by Cat Lane, who will and Tara, who will be providing, I guess, concrete examples of their work in measuring implementation in the settings that they work with. So before we go into implementation outcomes, and I know that's the main event and why people are here, I thought it might be worth spending just a couple of minutes on really kind of unpacking what implementation research is. I guess the main point for doing that is we can't really measure an outcome if we don't know what our implementation question is. So just to get everyone on the same page, I thought I would, I guess, very simplistically outline what implementation research is and involves. So this is, again, a very simplistic depiction of how things work to improve patient and public health outcomes. Simple, nice, linear boxes. So as you can see here, right on the left, there is the intervention or the guideline or the practice or the policy or the treatment, whatever it is in the setting, the thing that you want people to do in practice, and the thing that you are passionate about, you believe the evidence shows improves patient and public health outcomes. And in the past, in the past, we thought this kind of went directly here. And so this implementation was done, but kind of not explicitly so. And the problem with this is that we often didn't know if a lack of outcomes was due to this not working or just kind of this process not happening well enough. And so I guess implementation research is really kind of born out of the need to understand how to move this thing, the programs that we spend so much time developing into kind of routine practice, and really understand this process and how to really get things into practice. And so Jeff Curran, I guess very nicely puts it as kind of the thing you want to implement as perhaps the program or the treatment that you think should be in place, and implementation as understanding how to do those things into practice. So if there's one thing you take away from this slide and all those words, is that there are two distinct behaviors in play at all times. One is how your program works to improve health outcomes, and the second is how you're actively working, or people, the implementers, are actively working to get that program into practice. And that really is the focus of implementation research. And primarily, we do this via the development of implementation strategies. So implementation strategies is, I guess, simply things that you do to get the implementers to do the program. So there are things like training, or you might provide feedback on a particular practice, so audit and feedback to support changing of implementation behavior. So there are things that are probably not unusual to a lot of us, but kind of fall into that remit of implementation strategies. So I thought it might also be worth highlighting that implementation science is not completely new. As I'm speaking, I'm sure a lot of these concepts are familiar to people who do research and people who practice. So it's kind of the familiar concepts. And I will say I lifted this slide from the very talented Taryn Swindle. She presented this to her colleagues, and I thought it was just kind of really useful to highlight what we already know. So we do formative research regularly, context assessment, needs assessment if you work in public health, stakeholder engagement, I guess co-design is the word we use now, theory-driven interventions, kind of informed by process theory, and we do a lot of process evaluations of our programs. And so these are all familiar concepts that do get applied to understanding implementation processes. Potentially some of the kind of newer concepts that implementation science brings is that there's an explicit effort to link implementation to health outcomes, hence the need to know what an implementation outcome is. There's active manipulation of the different processes or the strategies, and we also want to know the impact of manipulating those strategies, so on kind of a range of implementation outcomes. So I thought it might just be worth highlighting that a lot of this is a familiar territory. It's that kind of making it more explicit and linking it to a particular outcome of interest. So finally, we get to implementation outcomes. So what are implementation outcomes? Enola Proctor and colleagues, they published, I guess, a very seminal piece for the field, really kind of conceptualizing what outcomes are important implementation proxies, I guess, that will help us understand the effect of implementation strategies. And checked today, I think it's been cited almost 4,000 times, so people are resonating with the need to measure implementation outcomes. And so Enola and colleagues have kind of defined the purpose of implementation outcomes as to understand the effects of action, so that implementation strategies on like whether things are actually being implemented in essence. Sorry, give me a second. So they can tell us their indicators of implementation success. They can also be proximal indicators of implementation processes. And they must be important intermediary outcomes for systems improvements or clinical outcomes, because ultimately that's the ultimate goal. And I guess, like I said a couple of slides ago, it really helps us distinguish between intervention failure, whether the intervention didn't work, or if a good intervention just wasn't deployed properly. So that's implementation failure in this instance. So again, another slide borrowed from Stephanie Tess, who she presented at a training event for us earlier in the year. And really this is outlining the kind of Proctor framework. I think there are expansions and additions, removals to this particular framework in the past couple of years, but in essence, these are the kind of core outcomes that, that get measured quite regularly in implementation studies. And so there's that distinguishing of kind of really the health service outcome, which is aligned with the IOM standards of care, and the health outcome, which I think we're all used to seeing get measured. That's the patient improvement, the physical activity, the nutrition type outcomes. And this is the list of implementation outcomes that really kind of has fundamentally shifted the field, I think, because finally we're measuring things that are similar enough to be compared. So I said earlier on that we can only answer a question, we can only measure something if we have a question to answer. So I think these are just kind of reflections from my work applying these outcomes in practice. That was a large list of outcomes to measure. And we all know kind of participant burden. We're trying to measure all things all at once. Now we've got to measure implementation outcomes as well. So I guess the kind of broad principle I use is when you're kind of interested in understanding implementation processes, or you want to use the data to inform development, or you want to use it to kind of iterate your implementation strategy, you might measure things like kind of potential reach, context, acceptability, feasibility, potentially determinants. That's, I guess, a whole other topic of measurement, which we won't go into today, I think. But if you want to test or assess the impact of the strategy you've put in place, then you might focus on measuring things like adoption, fidelity, and sustainability as these are the kind of closest proxy to influencing the health outcome that we're looking to achieve. So it basically kind of says the same thing as that previous slide. It depends on your question. Very often it's probably both, so you might measure them all, but you might kind of weight things towards different measures depending on what you're interested in answering. So I thought I would spend maybe a couple of minutes on this very crowded slide, but this focuses in on, I guess, the impact outcomes, the outcomes that we use to tell us if the strategy that you've put in place has had its effect or not, and how to kind of evaluate the effect. So often we will measure the impact of the intervention on adoption, and that's just simply defined as whether people decide to use the new innovation that you're introducing. So when you're thinking of measuring this, you might kind of really do a deep dive in terms of who's responsible for the decision to adopt this, because sometimes it's the manager, but oftentimes it's multiple people in the system that do need to make the decision to even introduce that idea into the organization. And then you might think about, that will help you think about who best to report on the outcome. A lot of the measurement lends itself to both quantitative and qualitative methods, but you might be able to do a survey, you could do interviews. If there's routine administrative data that you can use, often that's really great. So that's adoption. And then moving on to fidelity, which arguably is probably one of the more important implementation outcomes. I think there has been recent work prioritizing fidelity as a kind of key measure to focus on and to use high quality measures as much as we can. And I guess the reason for that is that it is directly linked to a health outcome, and intuitively it makes sense. The kind of better fidelity it's delivered, the more likely you are to produce a health outcome you want. And so when you're thinking of that, it's important to be clear about the key elements of the intervention that must be delivered. That idea of core components. It's not a straightforward question, but as the developer of the program, you might have some ideas, and also note the adaptations that might have occurred. Again, the same process of working out who's best to report on this and a range of ways to do this. Often this measure does lend itself to more administrative record data collection, and in public health observations or checklists are often used to assess this as well. And then sustainability, whether it continues to be delivered as you think it does. Tracking this long term, how will you track it? And the same kind of process of mapping across. And lastly, implementation costs, which is very similar to how you would do costs for a health program or a health innovation. Just collecting data on the cost to deliver the intervention. And you might consider whether it varies by different settings, and you might do a formal cost effectiveness of the strategy, which we have done in the past. And again, similar kind of processes. So I will touch on this, I guess, fairly briefly. I think this a good starting point if you're looking to measure things quantitatively. The implementation outcome repository, this is a free resource, and it, as you can see here, it lists the available instruments for each of the Proctor constructs that were shown in the pink diagram, and it links you to the original publication. So it's very handy, a handy place to get started if you just want to see what's out there. This is a very impressive review. I think it's over 100 measures included, where they again grouped it according to the Proctor framework, but also took it a step further by ranking their psychometric quality. So you might be able to select a measure that has the highest score on validity for each of the constructs of interest. There's the CERC instrument repository. I think this is available to paid members, a very similar repository to this one here, but moves a lot of the findings from this review into perhaps a more usable format. And this resource by Basika Rabin, so she did a scoping of all the available measurement resources for implementation resource in health. So that was as of kind of 2016, 2017, but again, it might give you a good place to start searching for measures that you can use in your own study. So yeah, this is probably not intended for anyone to see here, but just to demonstrate what's available in that measures review. And these are all the ranking by validity for each of the questionnaire they've included for measuring acceptability. So may just be useful resources that's free that you can use to get started when you're selecting measures. So I just wanted to kind of end on this and show because the various ways implementation science can be used to inform research, but also practice. So in its kind of most fundamental sense, when you're choosing implementation strategies, you're intentional about your implementation question, and you're selecting strategies based on your context, that is applying implementation science concepts into your practice. If you want to integrate it into research or the research that you do, you might measure implementation outcomes and delivery of the strategies that you choose. And to, I guess, move the science along, you might want to do trials of different implementation strategies. You want to test theories, look at mechanisms. There's lots of other people who have written lots of very useful pieces about how to advance the science. I think it's all kind of along a spectrum, whether you're implementing it in practice and measuring it formally, or really conducting large trials to really push the science along. So I will just acknowledge my salary funding as well as the National Centre of Implementation Science, and I will stop here and hand over to Kat as the next presenter.
Thanks, Serene. Over to you, Kat.
All right. I will just share my screen. All right, so thanks so much for that great overview, Serene. That was fantastic. I feel like I just learned there too. It's always great to have that recap. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Cassandra Lane. I typically go by Kat, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and I work within a fantastic integrated research practice partnership. And I also work as a qualitative data consultant, and I often say that qualitative data is my jam. So we'll touch on that a bit in today's presentation as well. Yeah, I'm originally from Canada, and that is actually where I am joining you from today. So I will start my presentation saying that I thankfully join you today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, so the Sanghees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'll give you a bit of a background of the program of work that I'm going to be using as an example to talk about implementation measures and outcomes. So basically, internationally, many schools fail to implement physical activity policies, and our team developed a multi-strategy intervention called PACE, or Physically Active Children in Education, to assist schools in New South Wales, Australia, to implement a government mandate for 150 minutes of physical activity across the school week. PACE consists of these 8 implementation strategies, and this is one of the things that Serene had just discussed in her presentation. And now, I guess this provides a good example of what such strategies might look like. So some of the main ones were we had number 1, centralized technical assistance and provide ongoing consultation. And that was our expert project officers providing support to schools ongoing throughout the intervention. There was mandate change, and this involved principal support within schools and policy development. There was identify and prepare in-school champions, which involved a full-day in-school champion workshop that was educational, interactive, and a lot of fun. I went to one or two, and it's always a good time. Another big one was number 5, conduct educational outreach visits, and that involved our project officers going out to schools and delivering 1 hour of education and activities to all staff at the school. And then we also provided schools with resources and equipment, like a physical activity equipment pack. Yeah, so that just kind of gives you an overview of what the intervention entails. So over the course of the past 6 years, we've undertaken a rigorous project of research, including theoretically informed intervention design, all the way through a series of randomized and controlled trials where we clustered the trials by school. And essentially, this has shown the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of PACE, with teachers at PACE schools scheduling significantly more minutes of physical activity, and then students are participating in significantly more minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Most recently, in the last box in this slide here, you can see the non-inferiority RCT. That's our most recent trial. And we actually adapted PACE to use more scalable modes of delivery. And we found that it was that this adapted scalable version of PACE was as good as the original version in achieving our outcomes, and that it had substantial cost savings, so approximately $373 per school. So this is awesome. PACE is effective, it's cost efficient, and uses scalable modes of delivery. We therefore considered it optimized for delivery by our health service, so within our jurisdiction. However, although the multi-strategy PACE intervention is effective, we wanted to know more about its implementation. For example, we knew that PACE was still better implemented by some schools compared with others, and we were interested why this was the case. And we also wanted to explore factors that were associated with implementation. And the idea was that we could use this information to further optimize PACE so that it would be deliverable to even more schools and potentially more generalizable within other contexts, whether that was statewide or world domination, who knows, right? Anyways, we just knew we needed to improve PACE, and we needed to know more about its implementation in order to do that. So the next step was to kind of determine how we would explore this and what approaches we would use. And to do this, we looked at two options. So the first one, we considered quantitative inquiry, which deals with numbers and statistics. And there are strengths and weaknesses that are associated with quantitative research. So this slide shows examples of some. So for example, we have strengths of quantitative inquiry being systematic data collection, greater reliability because of that. You can also gain insight from a large number of people within populations or across populations. You're able to identify similarities and differences between groups, and then the generalizability and replicability of the results. And then some weaknesses, you cannot provide the context or explain the why, and then limited value for investigation of new or unexplored areas. So our other option is qualitative inquiry, and which also has its own strengths and weaknesses. So some strengths include it is appropriate for answering those questions, how and why. It's useful for examining and exploring a research question on a subject that is not very well known, so where not a lot of data exists yet. It presents individual responses in their own words, images, and phrases. And it provides insider view. And then some of the weaknesses, it can be difficult to generalize the results and represent the problem. The research quality mainly depends on the researcher's knowledge, skills, and experiences. So the researcher themselves can largely influence the data and the results. And then there's no standard questioning, and it's subject to professional bias. So, fortunately, in our context, we had the capacity, resourcing, and experienced staff conducive to conduct both quantitative and qualitative. The idea being that we could really build on both data sets this slide basically shows it. You take the strengths of quantitative and the strengths of qualitative, and We combine those, and our results and our findings have superpowers. So it's just, you have the potential to find out even more than you would be able to with one data set alone. And again, in our context and for this study, we had the capacity to do this, so why not? I will first describe our quantitative approach. So the research objective was to measure each PACE strategy in regards to key implementation indicators. And we used several implementation measures to achieve this objective. So this included surveys of teachers, principals, and in-school champions, and then process records that were maintained throughout the intervention delivery by our project officers. And this was great because we had multiple perspectives from all the key implementation agents. We then needed to determine the implementation outcomes that we wanted to explore. Fortunately, a recent publication by McKay and colleagues provided a minimum data set of indicators that was relevant to our field of research. Using this resource, we consulted with the evaluation team, and we ended up choosing these implementation outcomes. So we had dose, adherence, adoption, and acceptability. And I think if I'm flying through some of these slides quickly, I know Megan wrote in the chat, but we will have copies of the slides sent out, so be able to access some of these resources and read more into it if you're interested. I hope you're interested. All right, so I'll now describe our qualitative research approach. So our qualitative objective was to explore the factors that influenced implementation from the perspective of key informants. And again, we had gained insight. We were able to gain insight from some of the key implementation agents. So we had the multiple perspectives for our qualitative data as well. And we used semi-structured one-on-one interviews with in-school champions and project officers. So we had that at the intervention level was our project officers, and then at the school level, that was represented with our in-school champions. So we actually used a purely inductive approach for our qualitative inquiry. Therefore, we didn't have any predefined implementation outcomes of interest for our qualitative analysis. The results of that analysis actually showed several implementation factors that influenced implementation. There was both barriers and facilitators that fell within three broad categories of external policy landscape, inner organizational context and structure, and PACE characteristics and processes. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I focused specifically on the implementation outcomes and measures that we use to assess implementation of PACE so that we were able to optimize it for greater and broader delivery. But more details of the full study can be found in our published paper in IJBMPA. And ultimately, I didn't get into it in this presentation, but we did actually take our quantitative and our qualitative data, and then we also integrated those data sets using mixed methods, triangulation protocol. It sounds wild, but it's not as intense as it sounds. Doing that, we were actually even able to expand even more on our findings. So that's almost another step. And again, I think it just really shows the power of using different methods of inquiry, and in our case it was quantitative and it was qualitative. I'd like to acknowledge the Awabakal people. So this is the traditional owners of the land on which the research was conducted, as well as the PACE delivery team, Hunter New England Population Health, and the University of Newcastle, the co-investigators that worked on this evaluation. And then the PACE delivery and evaluation team, I said them twice. We are very grateful for them. And then the National Center of Implementation Science. And then here's just a list of all of the PACE resources. If anyone's interested in learning more about the research that we've done or just the intervention itself. And PACE is an implementation strategy. So if you are interested in implementation, it could be of interest to see this kind of body of research that we've done. Yeah, that's everything.
Thanks so much, Kat. I'm going to hand over to Tara now. Yeah, so please, Tara, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, Meg, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see my slides? Great, thanks. So I'm Tara, I'm from Deakin University, and I'm going to talk to you today about implementation outcomes for stakeholders involved in healthy food retail. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also just like to acknowledge my funders, of which there's a few, our partners, and this slide is just my really excellent team at Deakin University, some of whom are involved in the research I'm going to present today. Sorry for embarrassing anyone that's here today. So just a little bit about me. I have a little bit of an unusual background for someone who works in nutrition. I actually have a Bachelor of Commerce and no nutrition degree at all. And then I went on to do a Master of Public Health and PhD. And I've been lucky enough that I've been working in the healthy food retail space for about 8 or 9 years now. And my focus has really been on multi-perspective evaluations, mainly using mixed methods. And more recently, I've become interested in co-design of resources and also implementation. And I just want to add a caveat that I'm not an implementation scientist, but I'm learning a lot about that area. And so I'm interested in learning from people that are on the call here today and the Implementation Science Centre. So thanks for having me here today. So why do we care about healthy food retail? Well, we know that food environments really strongly impact on people's diets and what foods and drinks they choose. And so by intervening in this area, we can really help to improve people's diets. And food retail can be conceptualised in a few different ways, and I'm going to talk to you about it in this way today. So we can think about grocery, so supermarkets, convenience stores, food service, which are your restaurants and cafes. And then we can also think about it in terms of organisation. So these might be your hospitals and health services, schools, sport and rec centres, universities. And this is kind of the area where I do most of my work I'm going to be talking to you about today. So thanks to Serene for that great introduction. I think it links really nicely to the point that I'm going to make here today, which is that policy, whether it's mandatory or voluntary, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be implemented or adopted. So what you can see on your screen here is that there's lots of policies that talk about organisational healthy food retail and health services in sport and rec and local governments. But what we found is that food environments are still pretty unhealthy across the spectrum. And there's a lot of implementation challenges, to implementing these kind of policies. And what you can see in front of you on the right-hand side is the systems thinking approach to retail transformation. So I'm not going to expect you to look into this in great detail, but this is a framework that myself and my colleague, Dr. Miranda Blake, have created and published. And it kind of demonstrates the potential leverage points through which to intervene within healthy food retail. And I'm just putting it up here today to really demonstrate that food retail implementation is incredibly complex and that there are lots of different stakeholders who you kind of need to engage and really understand at a deeper level to be able to implement healthy food retail. And the reference is at the bottom of the slide if you're interested. So as I mentioned, there's lots of different stakeholders that might be involved in healthy food retail implementation. And I'm just going to talk through some implementation outcomes that might be of interest to one stakeholder in particular, and that's the retailer and the retail staff. So why do we care about retailers and what they think about our policies and implementation strategies? Well, essentially we can't do healthy food retail without them. That should be pretty obvious, but I'm just putting it up there. Secondly, while us as kind of researchers or health promotion practitioners are really kind of concerned about the nutrition element of healthy food, of food retail, this might not be top of mind for retailers. And in fact, when you're a small business owner and you have staff to employ and you have your own families to feed, it's really important that you can pay your wages and you can break even and make profit. And so there sometimes can be real tension between nutrition outcomes and business outcomes. And so we need to understand how these can be aligned. And we also know from a lot of the work that myself and others have conducted that the implementation of healthy food retail policies is incredibly challenging, and that retailers do need a lot of support in the actual implementation. So I'm going to talk you through 2 case studies and kind of talk through how we use different implementation outcomes to engage retailers and sustain interventions. And then I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a reflection on why we would use those implementation measures. So the first case study is in YMCA Victoria Aquatic and Recreation Centres. So in 2017, they implemented a removal of sugary drinks policy, and we partnered with them to conduct an evaluation. We've actually got several papers that we've published in partnership with them. So during the removal of the sugary drinks, we conducted over 800 customer exit surveys at 4 of these centres, really focusing on the acceptability of this sugary removal policy. And we found that there was really high acceptance amongst the surveyed customers to support the removal of sugary drinks, and that customers, we collected some qualitative data as well. And through this, we found that there was a really strong narrative around supporting children's nutrition through this policy. And we were able to feed this back to YMCA and the retail outlet managers, and this kind of evidence of acceptability and protection of children's health and the importance of that helped support the sustained implementation of the policy, which is still in place now and has been also expanded to reduce unhealthy food as well as drinks. And I've got the published paper there in the corner. The second case study, oh, and I forgot to mention that's measuring acceptability. So again, my lack of implementation science knowledge, but I've tried to put it kind of through that Proctor framework that Serene shared with us. So the second case study is one that was led by my colleague, Dr. Miranda Blake, and is kind of really framed around the implementation cost. And this intervention was a 17-week, 20% increase on sugary drinks within a convenience store that is located within a health service. And what we did was present the sales data back to the retailer partway through this 17-week intervention to demonstrate that there was no impact on the total sales of drinks. And the customer surveys also indicated that most customers hadn't noticed that there was an increase in price and that the majority were supportive. And so the combination of this data helped allay really strong fears that the retailer and the staff had around loss of profitability and negative customer perception. So kind of to reflect on these measures, this is not an extensive list, but I've essentially tried to kind of frame the implementation outcomes according to Proctor within the context of healthy food retail, because I think that the language probably hasn't kind of intercepted into healthy food retail research. I think it's beginning to get there. But when we think about acceptability, there's, again, from that stakeholder perspective, we can think about acceptability from many different perspectives. And there are lots of different ways that you can measure this, and this is probably similar to measuring acceptability within other contexts as well, where we can think about exit surveys for customers or surveys with staff. And I've also popped some templates and examples there if you're interested in healthy food retail measurements. And you can also do retailer and staff interviews, and this might give you a little bit more in-depth knowledge on what elements of the policy or intervention are acceptable and less acceptable. And when we're thinking about implementation costs, this is really, as I mentioned, a big one for retailers and staff. Again, their livelihoods depend on being able to break even and make profit. And there's lots of different ways that you can measure this. And that depends on the retailer and what data they have available, but you can think about total sales, you can think about profit. We can also think about perceived sales and profit. What we found is particularly with smaller retail stores, they might not have a strong quantitative understanding of their own profits, but they have a feel for how well the business is going, and that can be through through customer interactions and things like foot traffic as well. And again, there's lots of different ways you can measure these. So we have previously done kind of complex sales data analysis, which I put an example there, noting that this is a high resource cost. So we partner with the biostatistician to do this work. You can also use sales data a bit more crudely, just looking at, kind of eyeballing it or using descriptive stats. And then you can measure retailer or staff perception of the impact. And I've just put some examples here. I won't go through them, but again, trying to place that Proctor framework lens through food retail. This is not an extensive list, but I've just popped some here. So in here, going through the other Proctor's implementation outcomes, how you might think about that in the context of food retail, and again, how you might measure these. And I'm just going to do a little bit of a plug here. So if you're interested in healthy food retail at all, if you're an academic or a practitioner, then you might be interested in our Centre for Research Excellence on Healthy Food Retail, CRE Refresh, and that's the email there. Particularly if you're a retailer or you're a practitioner, the Nourish Network is a multi-sector collaborative organisation that connects retailers, academics and practitioners, and there's several working groups where we kind of work on solving some of those big problems in healthy food retail together. So that's a really great place as well. And if you have any questions that I don't answer here today, please feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tara and Kat. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, they want to pop them in the chat. Yeah, we can get to those. I think Kat answered one from Hannah earlier in relation to who were the school champions. I also had one for you, Kat. So you had different implementation outcomes and amidst all your different options, and you chose sort of 4. How did you go about kind of working out which ones to choose?
Yeah, that can be really tough because there's so many, and like that resource that we used, the evaluation roadmap by McKay and colleagues, I think they include like 12 different implementation outcomes and then different implementation determinants as well. And ultimately, we had to make sure that we kept things feasible to measure, knowing that we were collecting this data from schools. So we basically, we had measures that already existed that we'd already used in past surveys, for example, to measure things like acceptability. So it made sense to keep those in, and that's something that the evaluation team all unanimously agreed was important. And then the other measures were, again, it was kind of decided as a team effort based on what was most important and then also feasible. So some things we could measure with our process records without putting burden on the team, on schools, sorry. So yeah, it took a bit of time and a bit of planning, but yeah, that's ultimately how we got to those 4 key ones.
Thanks, Kat. Oh, sorry, I'm just seeing questions coming through the chat. I think there's one for you, Tara, from Dimity. I'm just curious if you've done any research in the food retailers in the school settings.
Yes, thanks, Divinity. So I haven't actually personally done any research in this setting, but what's been really interesting anecdotally talking to practitioners who work in this setting is that there do seem to be quite a lot of common challenges and facilitators between the work we're doing in health services and sports and rec and schools. Obviously, they are different settings, but I think there's probably a little bit more lessons that we can kind of draw on and learn from.
Thanks, Tara. I'll try and speed through a couple questions have come through. So, Kat, a question from Alex that I'm also interested in. I think we're planning on using qual or mixed methods approaches, and the question was around how to plan for undertaking mixed methods research to assess implementation outcomes, and yeah, how using qual can, I guess, optimize it.
Yeah, so I guess it's a bit more foreign grounds or new emerging to use the qualitative and especially mixed methods. And I would recommend looking up what other researchers have used. There is quite a bit of literature emerging now and out there, and like even for myself, this was the first time I had used mixed methods to measure implementation, to explore implementation. And I just spent some time looking up other evaluations, implementation evaluations that used qualitative and then ones that use mixed methods. And I actually ended up contacting some of the researchers, even to ask about like what measures they had used or what questions they had used in their surveys, and just seeing the range of approaches and then choosing which would work best for our context. So I think definitely just perusing what's out there and seeing those options, that definitely helps a lot. And then asking around, because eventually like someone will come up who has experience with qualitative and or mixed methods. And typically, I mean, it's always such a good community in the health research service delivery world. So yeah, just seeking assistance either in written or in verbal format.
Thanks, Kat. And it is a collegial sort of world, this health services implementation space. And Tara, Alex had a question for you around sustainability of the YMCA intervention, how you measured it, what it looked like, and did you pick up any factors that impacted the sustainability of the policy?
Yeah, so we measured the implementation of the sugary drinks removal. I think it was 2 years after it had originally been implemented, and we found that it was reasonably well implemented. There was still a bit of movement around, particularly one of the challenges is for staff who are not nutrition trained to be implementing nutrition guidelines. And so one of the things that was challenging was around new drinks, like things like kombucha and, you know, kind of drinks that are advertised as being healthy or marketed as being healthy. So we found that some of those sugary drinks were kind of creeping back in. But one way that YMCA was able to kind of try and work around that was to get all of the centres on a standard ordering platform, and so that if they were able to limit what drinks could be picked at that kind of head level, or that really high level, then that helped sustain the implementation. But we didn't kind of do any qualitative work explicitly looking at sustainability. This is kind of more anecdotal feedback from YMCA.
Yep. Thanks, Tara. I think there were a couple of questions, one from Shani and one from Melissa, probably around implementation outcomes that potentially are a better indicator of implementation success. I think, and I think I mentioned in the present, and everyone else jump into Kat and Tara, Meg. In the presentation, I think I hinted at a number of, I guess, measures that I thought were more reflective of kind of effectiveness measure, just because it was a more direct proxy for the health outcome. There is an emerging literature around fidelity. I think one of the earlier papers by Deluc, where they looked at kind of fidelity of delivery with health outcomes across a range of behaviors and risk factors, kind of narratively identified that it could improving fidelity of implementation can improve impact of health outcome impact by about 20 times were their estimates. So that's a very kind of early paper. I have seen a couple more opinion pieces by very big names in the field that have argued for fidelity to perhaps be a little bit elevated over the others in terms of measurement. And I can send those papers through. I think they're a little bit more opinion based, and although they do cite some empirical research, and I think I tend to agree with that opinion, just because it does appear to be a direct proxy for for the health outcome you're hoping to achieve, but maybe that's a bit of a simplistic assumption. So I guess in terms of ranking, I do tend to, if I've got $10, I do tend to spend $7 of those dollars on fidelity, if you want to think of it that way. Did anyone want to add to that? I felt like that was just a bit of an informed guess, more so than anything. No, I think we might have time for just one more question from Tess. So do the presenters have any opinion or recommendations around the effectiveness of different implementation frameworks? And if we're interested in an implementation science course, do you have any recommendations? I feel like the second part of the question, Meg, I might be throwing you under the bus. You've done a bit of a kind of recce or a scoping of what training, resources, etc. And that information is available on maybe a plug, the NCOIS website.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll certainly send around our list of implementation kind of training and sort of existing static, webinars that have been out there or other training. But the other thing is the Australian TIDA course, which is run through the National Centre of Implementation Science. So that will probably be happening again next year. So keep your eyes peeled on our website, that one.
And just kind of quickly, I'm noticing the time on the effectiveness of different implementation frameworks. Again, I think that's like $1 million question. There are certainly more conventional frameworks. So you've asked specifically around the ProSci outcome model, which is, I guess, an organizational change theory, which I guess is very relevant to changing systems and organization behaviors that we do often in implementation science. I don't know if there's indication of effectiveness, but there's certainly theories that are better studied. So the CIFA, which is the Consolidated Framework of Implementation Research, because it was so seminal, so widely used, released measures quite early on. There's much more empirical research exploring links. The TDF, which if you know population health research, we are big TDF users. We've tried to, in many ways, empirically link the TDF theoretical domains framework that is constructs to implementation outcomes in various kind of formal mechanistic evaluations. But Susan Nickey has published a lot on, linking BCTs to TDF constructs, to how that maps to implementation strategies. And there's an online kind of BCT tool mapping resource. I guess the kind of frequent criticism of the TDF is that it's very individual focused. So potentially maybe hard to apply to settings, maybe even like yours, Tara, that's quite organization and system focused. So I think the short answer is kind of there's guidance on how to pick theories and frameworks for your particular context. I don't think there's still strong linking or empirical data linking particular constructs to outcomes yet, but particular models are better studied. So that was a very quick summary and overview. I will have to stop here, I assume. Yes, we've gone 1 minute over, so thank you very much for yes, $10. Yeah, for joining us today. I hope you have learned something, or given you some things to think about in your work and in your research moving ahead. So I will stop here. Meg, are you jumping back in, or shall we?
Say thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thank you. Bye.